All right, we are now back live on Facebook. Facebook, welcome. We're now into my portion of the teaching. We're talking about who's the boss, women and men in biblical and cultural context. Let's pray as we get into today's message. Father, we thank you in Jesus' name for this word that we're going to be bringing today, this study that we're going to be doing. As always, we ask you to be our teacher, our guide, and our primary teacher, that you would fill us with the knowledge of your will and all wisdom and spiritual understanding, so we can walk worthy of you unto all pleasing and be fruitful unto every good work. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we've been talking about, and we're moving towards, trust me, we are moving towards looking at and interpreting 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12, where in our English translations, most of them say this: I do not permit a woman to teach, nor to usurp or to have authority over a man. My argument has been, as I've been doing this, is that in order for us to properly interpret that passage, we must look at the passage in the correct context, the historical context, the cultural context, the linguistic and literary context, for us to better understand this passage. And just before we came on, one of the reasons we were a little bit longer is because we were discussing in our fellowship in the Zoom room about what's going on in the Southern Baptist denomination. I believe just recently they sought to pass a law in their denomination where if you have women pastors and you maintain women pastors in your fellowship, or you've ordained them, that you would be removed from the Southern Baptist denomination. I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think they did a vote and it didn't pass. I could be wrong, but that's where it's being pushed, because they are, Southern Baptists are complementarians. Complementarians do not believe that women can be ordained as pastors and serve along men equally with pastoral authority and over men. One of the scriptures that's used is and I think is one of the primary ones, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, where it is written, I do not permit a woman to teach, nor to usurp or have authority, depending on which translation you read, to have authority over men. So we've been looking at and saying, okay, well, let's really try to understand this passage, 1 Timothy 2:12. Let's not start there. Let's start with the larger context. And that's what we've been doing. And what we've seen up to this point is that in 1 Timothy 2, Paul, as we have seen, is dealing with issues of godliness. He's dealing with issues of honor and shame in a first century Jewish and Greco-Roman context. He's having to do this because of false teachings and false teachers that have infiltrated the church at Ephesus. These teachings are producing behaviors by those who embrace it. They're producing behaviors that are disruptive and that are dishonoring among the members of that community. It's happening within the church assembly in itself, and I believe it's also happening outside of the church assembly in the homes of the members of the church at Ephesus. The false teachers and teachings seem to be especially targeted at some of the wealthy women in the congregation. Now, we've dealt with this, and you can go back and look at it again in some of the previous sessions. This is actually part 5 of reconstructing the world of 1 Timothy, is what we're kind of using as a title for this. We're trying to reconstruct the cultural world, the historical world, and even the literary and linguistic world of 1 Timothy 2:12. And so there were false teachers there. And let me say this too: there are those who contest that the main problem was false teachers. One of them being Mike Winger. I was listening to someone who was critiquing Mike, and they were going through his 11.5 hour video, not the whole thing. They were taking parts of it and going through it. And one of the things that Mike said as I was watching this, and I'm going through that 11.5 hour video now, is that Mike does not believe that, Mike Winger does not believe that false teaching was really the main problem. And by saying that, and he addresses egalitarians, which would be like myself, who have said this is one of the problems with the problem is false teachers. And he gives his reasons why he believes they are not. And let me say, I listened to it and I thought it's a poor argumentation. I'm not going to deal with that in these series of messages, but I'm planning to do some side messages, you could say, some supplementary messages, where I will be directly addressing why I think Mike is wrong to dismiss the idea that false teachers and their teachings, false teachings, are the problem. Okay, but here, what we're saying is that the problem is false teachings and false teachers, those who embrace it, are end up, because of that false teaching, they are producing behaviors in the congregation and in their homes that are causing them to dishonor and shame others. That some of these wealthy women, not all of the women. So one of my contentions is that when Paul is dealing with women in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15, he's not necessarily dealing with all women. He's dealing with some wealthy women in the congregation. I've given reasons previous messages, go back and watch them. These wealthy women, not all of the women, but these wealthy women who embrace the false teaching are acting in ways that are dishonoring and shaming some of the men, some of the male teachers, some of the husbands in the fellowship. And I say all of those because I think all of those are being impacted. So, but at the very least, what we can say is this: these women are acting in ways that are disruptive and that are dishonoring. These wealthy women, not all women. And the way that these wealthy women are acting, it's not only dishonoring and shaming, but it's for them and for the people that they are relating to, but it's causing dishonor and shame for the entire community. And this is arousing competition for honor, which is causing endless strife and arguments. Competing for honor. They are dishonoring people. When you dishonor someone in the first century Greco-Roman world, you challenge their honor, which calls for a response. You challenge someone's honor, it causes a response. And this is the cause of conflict. Remember 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8, Paul says, I would that men everywhere, that they would lift up their hands without wrath and arguing. Well, where is the wrath coming from? We've established that this type of wrath comes from being, the word that's used, orge in Greek, it comes from people being challenged, people being belittled, people being dishonored. And so the question was, who's dishonoring these men? And what I've posited and suggested is that it is certain wealthy women within the assembly, that they are challenging the honor of the men, and this is causing conflict. It's causing arguing, okay, both with men, with husbands, with teachers. Okay, so, and we said that this is also a problem because this causes the believers in Ephesus to be looked upon with suspicion by Rome. Again, we've covered this in a previous message, and that was serious. They are looked upon as dangerous. They are looked upon as detrimental because of all of this strife and some other things that are going on, which we're going to be covering as we move towards 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. Okay, so what Paul is doing in 1 Timothy, the letter as a whole, is he's providing Timothy with guidance and how to call the believers back to honorable and virtuous behavior. He's telling Timothy what he needs to do where his own life is concerned. He's telling Timothy how he needs to deal with these people who are being disruptive and dishonorable in the congregation. We see him doing this with the rich women in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 and 10. If you have your Bibles, open there, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 and 10. Verse 9, Paul says, I'll start at verse 8. I desire, therefore, that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath, without a desire to challenge others and punish others because they feel belittled, and without doubting or arguing. Oh, by the way, one of the things that I said last week, we talked about the fact that the word for doubting and argument deals with argumentation. It deals with teachers being challenged in their teaching, which can demean, which is a challenge to the honor of the teaching. One of the things I said is that one of the ways this would be done in the first century was by those who challenge a teacher by asking questions. There were certain type of questions called nonsense questions or barut questions that would challenge the teaching of a rabbi. We saw this with Jesus. Go back and watch last week's message number 60, where I went into detail about this. And I suggested that it's a possibility that this could be what is happening because the word for argument could also, one of the words for argument that's used when Paul talks about disputings or arguings, it can mean speculative argument. I've been reading a dissertation by Dr. Lynn Kitson. It's her dissertation on 1 Timothy chapter 1. And the dissertation, let's see if I have the name of it here. Where is it? It's going to come. It's called The Rhetorical Strategies of 1 Timothy, the relationship of the first chapter to the purpose of the letter. In Dr. Lynn Kitson's, and it's a wonderful dissertation, by the way, she later on put this in a book called Persuading Shipwrecked Men. But in Dr. Lynn Kitson's dissertation, she really, she later on put this in a book called Persuading Shipwrecked Men. She really, she later on put this in a book called Persuading Shipwrecked Men. She later on put this in a book called Persuading Shipwrecked Men. And I've been trying to get a copy of the book, haven't been able to get it yet. But I got a hold of her dissertation from which the book comes. She talks about in the book that the word translated as disputes or arguments could also, and she cites scholars where it could also be translated as intensive questioning, which I thought it could be. I wasn't sure, but I was reading this past week and I went, oh, okay, I am on the right track. So it could very well be that one of the ways that the honors of the teachers, because remember, Paul talks about speculations, arguments. The word in Greek can refer to intensive questions. And we said that Paul calls some of these questions foolish or foolish questions. Foolish questionings, intensive questioning is where you would challenge the honor of a teacher. You would challenge their interpretation. This was a challenge to honor, and it created conflict. This, I suggest, is what's happening that the false teachers are doing, and that some of the false teachers may be some, and I believe that they are, some of the rich women in the congregation. As a matter of fact, let me read to you from this book, Letter and Homilies. And sorry, I had to blur my background, but it's called, where is it at there? There we go. Letters and Homilies in Hellenized Christianity by Dr. Ben Witherington. Dr. Ben Witherington has this to say about the women in the congregation, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. He said, the contentious situation, talking about the situation at Ephesus, the contentious situation reflected in the present verses likely should be related to the problems of the false teachers, some of whom may well have been women or at least had influence some high status women, hence the correction in the following verses. And he means verses 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. Okay? He is saying that some of the false teachers, and there are other scholars who believe, not all scholars, but there are many scholars, especially egalitarian scholars, that believe that some of the false teachers were the wealthy women. That is my position, that some of the false teachings are being spread by some of the women, wealthy women, not all women, the wealthy women in the congregation. Okay, so, and this is causing conflict. This is the reason, not simply because the women are teaching. It's not like, oh, women are supposed to be teaching, that's why they're conflict. It's no, these women are spreading false teaching. And they are, in spreading the false teaching, they are contradicting some of the other teachers, some of the other teachers, the male teachers in the congregation, questioning them, challenging them in their teaching, which is also a challenge to their honor. And a challenge of honor always gives rise to conflict. This is why Paul is saying that there are men there who are angry. And the idea of angry is not simply they feel angry, but they're acting in order to punish those that they feel belittled by. And the ones that I'm saying are belittling them, at least some of the people that are belittling them, are some of the rich women in the congregation. And we're going to find out more about this and give more evidence for this as we go on today. All right. So what Paul is doing again is providing Timothy with guidance and how to call the believers back to honorable and virtuous behavior. We see him doing this with the women in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 and 10. Let me read it again, what Paul says in verse 9. He says, I desire therefore that, verse 8, I desire therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. This is what we're going to look at today. So we see Paul calling for the rich female believers to adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation. I've already covered how we know that they are rich women. Again, go back to last week's message and the week before that. I go explain in detail why these are well-to-do women, and he's not talking to all of the women in the congregation. Now, Paul is calling them to adorn themselves, to dress in modest apparel with propriety and with moderation. Now, this is in contrast with the elaborate hairstyles and the expensive clothing that Paul is calling them away from. He says again in verse 9, in like manner, and this has to do with, this is how I want the women to pray. This is like I don't want the men praying with wrath, seeking to get their honor back through acts of punishment or acts of dishonoring other people to get their honor back. He says, I don't want them to do that. I don't want them to engage in this arguing that's been going back and forth. He says, in the same manner, I don't want the women doing this. I don't want the women seeking for honor as they are appearing before God and they're praying. I don't want them to do it, whether it's in the home or in the congregation. I don't want them doing it. He says, so in a like manner, and the like manner has to do with the praying. He said, I want also the women to adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, and not with braided hair. So he says, listen, he's contrasting how they are to dress. Okay, so he's contrasting the elaborate hairstyles and expensive clothing with modest apparel, propriety, and with moderation. Now, these are virtues. Paul is literally saying, I want them to adorn themselves with virtue, okay? Though modest apparel, we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. But he's basically saying, I don't want them to dress with expensive clothing because that sends a message. If they're dressing in expensive clothing, that sends a message, as we said before, that they are engaging in the vice of luxuria, which is self-indulgence, being materialistic, only concerned about themselves and their own desires and their own pleasure. This was, as we said last week, a dishonorable vice. So when Paul says, I don't want the woman to dress this way, he says, I don't want them to, because this would have signaled to the larger world and to the community that they were part of, as well as the larger Greco-Roman world, these people lack self-control. These people lack self-restraint. These people are dressing themselves in vice. The clothing sent a message. You are dressed in vice, not in virtue. So he says, I don't want them to dress and adorn themselves in that which points to vice, moral, what we would call today sin, but it was more, take in terms of vice. I want them to dress in such a way that they adorn themselves in virtue, or they show themselves to be virtuous, okay? And each of the things that Paul mentions here are virtues, and they are honorable behaviors. They are virtues and honorable behaviors that were seen as the qualities and part of the lifestyle of honorable and virtuous women. Let me say that again. Paul is calling them to engage in a certain way of dressing, and he's calling them to engage in certain actions that were part of the lifestyle of honorable and virtuous women. Let me read to you from a book by a scholar named Susan Hyland. This is called Finding Phoebe, What New Testament Women Were Really Like. Very good book, highly recommend. This is what she says about what we just read here. See page 88. This is what she says about the dress of women. She said, the words used to describe the ideal woman are actually very consistent over many centuries. The ideal of a virtuous woman was one who was modest, industrious, and loyal to her family. Now notice here that she says that, and she's actually stating this in connection to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9 and 10. Modesty and being industrious, and we'll talk about that later, these were seen as virtues. And so what Paul here is calling the people to dress in virtue. So let's talk about each of the virtues that he mentions here in a little bit of detail. So first of all, he says, and I'm reading, by the way, New King James, you might be reading something different, but the first one he mentions is that he wants the women to dress in modest apparel. Now, the word modest here in the Greek is the Greek term kosmios, and it means orderly or well arranged. Now, by the first century, this word could relate to, but before the first century, this word could relate to women dressing in ways that were not seductive, that were not sexualized, okay, before the first century. But by the first century, the time period, by the first and second century, the time period that we are dealing with, this term referred to simple dress in contrast to expensive dress. Let me read to you another book by Susan Hyland called Women in the New Testament. Women in the New Testament. Women in the New Testament World, okay? And basically, these two books are the same. This one is written more specifically within a Christian context. This one writes more specifically in the Greco-Roman context. Some of the same material, honestly. You could get either one. I happen to have both. And this is what she says about the term modest or modest apparel. Let me read to you from this book here. She says in one place, by the first and second century, modesty in dress more often meant simple as opposed to lavish attire. So in this time period in which we're reading this, modest apparel while in an earlier period, it could have to do with women wrapping themselves and keeping themselves clothed so that people could see their bodies. Because the idea was that if you weren't completely covered up, you were trying to advertise yourself, and it could be seen as women were dressing seductively. But by the 1st and 2nd century, modesty in dress more often meant simple as opposed to lavish attire. So rather than wearing a bunch of expensive clothing, you wore simple clothing. She goes on to say in another place, let's see, where's it at here? Oh, I'm reading the wrong place. Here we go. He said, she quotes a philosopher named Crates, and this is what Crates says. He said, adornment, said Crates, is what adorns. Now remember, Paul says, I want them to adorn. Crates says, adornment is what adorns. And what adorns a woman is what makes her better ordered. Now, what did we say this word for modest is in Greek? Is kosmios, which means orderly or well arranged. So Crates says here, adornment is what adorns, and what adorns a woman is what makes her better ordered. Not gold, nor emerald, nor scarlet, but whatever gives an impression of dignity, discipline, and modesty. Okay? So instead of elaborate dress, women could be metaphorically adorned with virtue. All right? So this is what this verse is talking about here, is that it's talking about women wearing simple dress as a way of conveying dignity, discipline, or modesty. In other words, as Dr. Highland says here, modest dress required self-discipline and thus displayed one's virtue. So modest dress displayed your virtue. So when Paul says, I want women to adorn themselves in modest apparel, simple clothing, the purpose of that was that simple clothing conveyed the idea of virtue. It conveyed, as we're going to see, the idea of self-control versus the idea of a lack of self-control. So he's asking them, or he's telling Timothy, hey, the women need to adorn themselves. This was part of the accepted values of the culture, the larger culture. This is the way if you wore too much of expensive clothing, as we said before, it could backfire and people could see you as indulging in the vice of luxuria, and luxuria was seen as detrimental and dangerous, not only to your community, but to Rome itself. So Paul is telling them, don't do things that's going to cause you to be looked upon as dangerous and detrimental. Do the things that will cause you to be seen as an asset and a benefit. Wear simple clothing. Okay, now this is 1st century we're talking about here. So in the 1st century, modest dress displayed one's virtue. So modest apparel has to do with dressing simply to show that you are a woman of virtue, and as we're going to see, self-control. Now, the next virtue that Paul mentions, and he wants the women to adorn themselves with, is propriety. Now, what is propriety? The Greek word is eidos, A-I-D-O-S. There is a book that was written called Eidos, The Psychology and Ethics of Honor and Shame in Ancient Greek Literature, by a scholar named Douglas Cairns, C-A-I-R-N-S, Douglas Cairns. Hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So he wrote a whole entire book on this Greek concept, and it's a virtue, eidos. Sometimes some translations will translate it as propriety or shamefacedness, but what exactly does it mean? Now, this word is very important. Eidos, according to Dr. Cairns, he says this, quote, eidos includes concern both for one's own honor and that of others. That is so important. Let me read it again. He says, quote, eidos includes concern both for one's own honor and for that of others. As a result, part of the function of eidos is to recognize the point at which self-assertion encroaches illegitimately upon the honor of others. This means that eidos is concerned not only with one's own prestige, but also with the concept of moderation and appropriateness in the pursuit of prestige. Now, that's a lot. What is he saying? He says, when you are clothed with the virtue of eidos, and this is what Paul tells the women to be clothed with, you're not only concerned with your own honor, you are concerned with the honor of others. Remember, we said before that what the women were doing was impacting not only them, it would impact their community. It would impact the honor of the community. It would impact another, or let me say it this way. What the women, the way they were dressing with all of the elaborate, expensive clothing, it would cause the community to be shamed. It would cause the men in the community to be shamed. It would cause the women to be shamed in the eyes of the Greco-Roman world. So Paul, in contrast to this, he says, look, if you are wearing this expensive clothing, you're only concerned with your own honor. And remember, we said before, this is why women would display their wealth by the elaborate hairstyle and the expensive clothing, because they wanted to get more honor for themselves. They were only thinking about themselves. This is why luxuria is seen as being self-indulgent. You're selfish. You're focused in on yourself, and you're just indulging in your own desires and trying to get more honor by showing your wealth off. In contrast to that vice, Paul says, I want you to practice the virtue of Hybris, which is concerned not only with your own honor, but you're concerned with, hey, how is this impacting other people? How is this impacting my community? How is this impacting the men in my community? How is this impacting my husband if they're married? How is it impacting? You're not just concerned with yourself. Paul is calling them to be concerned for the honor of others, not just for their own honor. And as I said that, this made me think of something that Paul wrote to the Philippians. Go over to Philippians, hold your place in 1 Timothy, hold your place in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Go to Philippians chapter 2. So I said that, I went, oh, this relates to what Paul said in Philippians. So Philippians, let's go to Philippians chapter 2. Where's Philippians at? Oh, here it is. Philippians chapter 2. And notice what Paul says here. Let's start off with verse 1. If there is any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Verse 3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. Verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So now go back over to 1 Timothy 2. So even in Philippians, Paul is telling them, without using the word, he's telling them to practice Hybris. Don't be only concerned with yourself. Don't only act out of selfish ambition. Don't only act in order to be seen as honorable for your own self-interest. Be concerned about how is what I'm doing impacting the others that I'm connected to. This is a virtue that Paul is calling them to. So Paul here is telling Timothy to instruct the rich women to not be or act ostentatious in their pursuit of honor, which would bring dishonor. And they are not to be concerned with their own honor, but they're to be concerned with, and they're to guard and uphold the honor of others in the community. This is a virtue. This is what Hybris does. Okay? So seeking to guard, protect, and uphold the honor of others and not just their own honor, it was a virtue that Paul wanted the rich women to pursue. They were to clothe themselves with this mindset, this attitude, and the practices that would not only where they're not only seeking their own honor, but they're seeking to uphold and guard and preserve and protect the honor of the community. That's important. So so this is what this word means. This is why I said it's important. If as we go and we look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, we need to look at the what I call the linguistic context. Paul is saying specific things. When I have read 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 and 10, one of the things I did was I thought, let me see, because I had a hunch about something. Because I know growing up, I've been a Christian since I was 14. I'm 59 now. I've heard a lot of sermons. I've heard sermons on this passage. And normally when people read this passage, and I went and checked this out on YouTube, I listened to several pastors, even complementarian pastors, teach on this passage. Well, mostly everybody says is this when I get to this passage. Okay, the women were not supposed to wear a lot of expensive clothing. They had gold and stuff. And if you can imagine, they're going into their church services and it's distracting. Hey, Paul was saying, don't wear things that are distracting. Paul wasn't really saying that you can't braid your hair. And he really was, even though Paul says, let it not be the braiding of hair, but we talked about the type of hair that was braided. It wasn't just simple braids. It was mounds and mounds of hair that took hours to prepare, took slaves to help you to do it. But mostly this is interpreted as Paul is not here, not saying you can't look nice. Paul is saying God is more concerned about the inner person. He's more concerned about your heart. Okay, that's somewhat true, but the main thing Paul was saying is this way that you're dressing, this is dishonorable behavior in the eyes of the culture. And I want you to engage in honorable behavior. Stop this dishonorable behavior, which is causing disruption, which is causing conflict. This way of dressing. I want you to take on virtues, engage in honorable, virtuous behavior that will meet the goal that he set in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, where we live a quiet and peaceable life with all dignity. He's calling them to behavior that will promote that and that will cause them to not be seen as a threat to Rome. This is why it's important. Before we interpret 1 Timothy chapter 2 and what it means, we have to look at these words and break them down. And so here, ADAS has to do with protecting, being concerned with protecting, guarding, upholding the honor of others that you are connected to, that are a part of your community. This is what Paul is calling them to do. And that is really, really important. This is what's calling these rich women to do. The next virtue that he mentions is moderation. In my New King James Version, he calls it moderation. The term in Greek is sophrosune. Sophrosune, Sophrosyne, or if you do an English transliteration, Sophrosune, Sophrosune. Now, what does this mean? This word can refer to being frugal. It can refer to frugality, self-control, which is one of the primary meanings of the term, and also sexual chastity, or meaning that you preserve sex only for marriage. So you're sexually chaste and pure, which within the Christian context means sex only within marriage. Susan Hyland, again, talks about this in her book, Women in the New Testament World. Let me read to you what she says. And again, one of the reasons I offer these books is so that I bring out these books is so that you can go and read these books yourself. You can go and, because sometimes people go, they want to, where are you getting this information from, Mike? This is why I cite the sources. Page 45 in Susan Hyland's book, she says this about sophrosune. She said the Greek word sophrosune, or modesty, also meant self-control. Its opposite, the opposite of sophrosune, was a Greek term, akolazia, self-indulgence. So akolazia is self-indulgence. The sophron, the wise or self-controlled person, prioritize the needs of the household or city over his or her own pleasures. So the person who was self-controlled, the sophron, which was the self-controlled person or the wise person, they made more important, they prioritized the needs of the household or the needs of the city over his or her own pleasure. Sophrosune was both a male and a female virtue. If you read through the New Testament, you will see both men and women being called to sophrosune. They are all called to self-control. They are all called to prioritize the needs of others over their own needs, meaning, let's be clear and nuanced about this. When it says prioritizing their own, the needs of others over their own needs, is again being in contrast to akolazia, self-indulgence, meaning that they're not self-indulgent. They're not spending all of their resources on themselves. Remember I said before, luxuria was seen as a sin because if you are spending all of your wealth on yourself, on your clothing, on your hair, that was seen as you're directing resources away from your household, away from your family, away from your civic responsibility. This is why it was seen, and this could cause the collapse in the Greco-Roman mind. It could cause the collapse of a city. It could cause the collapse of a family, cause the collapse of the city, cause the collapse of the empire, because all of these were seen as connected. You know, the empire was made up of cities. Cities were made up of families. If the families are not intact, the cities are not going to be intact. If the families fall apart, the city's going to fall apart. If the cities fall apart, the empire will fall apart. This is why this was seen as dangerous. Luxuria, or being self-indulgent, or practicing acolasia. If you were self-indulgent, it could cause destruction, not just of your own self, but it impacted your family, which impacted the city, which impacted the empire. You follow me? Does that make sense? This was the thinking in the first century Greco-Roman world. So people who were self-controlled we're seeing people who practice moderation or self-control, sophrosyne, they prioritize the needs of others. They didn't practice self-indulgence. They practiced discipline of their desires. Doesn't mean that they didn't meet any of their desires. It's just they were disciplined about it. They were not overindulgent. They made sure that other people and their needs were being taken care of. It was self-control was one of the key virtues in the Greco-Roman world. There was what was considered 4 cardinal virtues: the virtue of courage, the virtue of wisdom or prudence, the virtue of, what was the other one? Oh, righteousness or justice, and then self-control. These were the 4 cardinal virtues. It's like these are the virtues upon which all other virtues are built. So self-control was an extremely important virtue, and it was both a male and a female virtue. It wasn't just, so when Paul here is specifically talking to the females, why? Because they're wearing all of this elaborate clothing and hair. It looks like from the outside world, hey, you are engaged in self-indulgent behavior that is a threat to your family, which is a threat to the city, which is a threat to the empire. Okay? So, according to Dr. Hyland and the philosophical writings at the time, because a lot of people wrote about sophrosyne, they wrote about self-control, this is what they believed. They said that self-control was at the heart of what it meant to be a leader. We're going to talk more about that because this is really important as we are interpreting as we're going through 1 Timothy chapter 2, as we get to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, and then we're going to go over into 1 Timothy chapter 3, where it talks about bishops or elders. This is important when it says that self-control was at the heart of what it meant to be a leader. And this is something that I've seen as I've done my studies on self-control, Greco-Roman masculinity, what it meant to be a leader. Self-control was important to be a leader. And by the way, what's one of the fruits of the spirit? Temperance or self-control. Sophrosyne. I think there's another word that's used in Galatians chapter 5, inkratia, I believe is what the word is, but it's still self-mastery, self-control. It's one of the other words for self-control. This is a fruit of the spirit that is applicable to both men and women. So once again, Paul's call for the rich women to abandon elaborate and ostentatious clothing, hairstyle, and jewelry in order to increase their honor. He was calling them away from that. He was calling them to care about the honor of others. He was calling them away from being concerned about their own honor, which is demonstrated by what they were wearing, the expensive clothes, the ostentatious clothing, the elaborate hairstyle. And he was calling them in each of these virtues to be concerned about others, to be concerned about the honor of others, to be concerned to make sure that others and that the needs of others were being met. These were virtues. Now, the fact that Paul is calling them away from a vice of just caring about themselves and their own virtue, and he's calling them to care about the honor and the virtue of others, means that these women were operating in another, remember we said that one of the vices they were operating in was luxuria. Another vice that they were operating in is known as the vice of hubris. Hubris. Hybris or Hubris. Hubris. Okay? This is another vice that Paul is, without using the term, he's alluding to that these women are operating in hubris. What is hubris? Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about hubris. You're going to see why it's important in just a moment, because hubris, from what we're going to talk about, is at the basis of all of this. And, well, hubris is being produced by the false teaching. Okay, and it's interrelated with the false teaching. What I'm going to share with you now, I'm indebted to Dr. Lynn Kitson and her dissertation, which I mentioned earlier, The Rhetorical Strategies of 1 Timothy, the relationship of the first chapter to the purpose of the letter. So what I learned about, I was introduced to this concept by Dr. Lynn Kitson's, her dissertation, and I went and did a little bit more research on it and did a little bit more reading on it. Looked up some of the things that she had referenced, some of the authors and scholars she had referenced. But I want to give credit where credit is due. It's because of her that I found out about this concept. And as I'm reading her dissertation, I went, oh, this relates to the women. Now she's applying it. She talks about certain men that is talked about in 1 Timothy chapter 1. As a matter of fact, go back over to 1 Timothy chapter 1. Paul says in verse 3, as I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine, nor give heed to fables and endless genealogies, which cause disputes rather than godly edification, which is in the faith. Okay, I want to stop right there for now. Let's see. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything here. He said, so verse 3, he says, I want you, he left him in Ephesus. Paul told Timothy, I left you in Ephesus that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine. I think some translations say that you charge certain men. The term in Greek actually doesn't use the word men. It doesn't use the word anar or aner, A-N-E-R. It's the Greek term tis, T-I-S, which is a gender inclusive term, which can mean anyone, someone, anybody. He said, I want you to charge certain people, basically, that they do not teach other doctrine. This is why there are some egalitarians, or many egalitarians, me being one of them, who says that the people that Paul is talking about is not just men, but also includes women. That the false teachers are not just men, but it also includes women, because Paul uses a term that is gender inclusive. He doesn't use a term that is exclusively masculine. Okay, and in the text, he's not talking. There's nothing that says in the text specifically that I'm just talking to men here. Okay, we know he's talking to men and women as we read throughout it, and that some of the things that are said about the women, as I said in a previous lesson, have to do with the false teaching. That the women, it shows that the women are spreading these false teachings. Now, I wanted to share that. Because she's applying her research to certain men and to young men. But what she talks about in terms of the concept of hubris, that it applies, as I was studying, I said, this applies to the women that Paul is dealing with, the rich women, the wealthy women in 1 Timothy chapter 2. So let's define what hubris is. When I thought about hubris, I just thought it meant pride. Hubris is pride, but there's a little bit more to it. She talks about a scholar named N.R.E. Fisher, who wrote a book called Hubris, A Study in the Values of Honor and Shame in Ancient Greece. He says in his book, Dr. Fisher, quote, hubris is the essential assault on the honor of another, which is likely to cause shame and leads to anger and attempts at revenge. Stop. Remember what I said about 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8, where Paul says, I would that men everywhere lift up their hands without anger, orge, and arguing or disputes, right? Remember I said that orge refers to a desire for revenge because you have been belittled or dishonored. What I said was causing the dishonoring was that certain women were demeaning the men. What was causing the women to demean the men? Hubris. Okay? Dr. Fisher again says that hubris, quote, is the essential assault on the honor of another, which is likely to cause shame and leads to anger and attempts at revenge. It is essentially a deliberate activity, and the typical motive for such infliction of dishonor is the pleasure of expressing a sense of superiority. The reason people engage in this act of dishonoring other is so that they will feel superior to the person that they are dishonoring. Okay? And again, this is Dr. N.R.E. Fisher in his book, A Study in the Value of Honor and Shame in Ancient Greece, and he was quoted by Dr. Lynn Kitson in her dissertation. Another scholar by the name of Douglas Cairns said, and this is from his journal article, Hubris, Dishonor, and Big Thinking in the Journal of Hellenistic Studies. Again, this is a quote from Dr. Lynn Kitson's dissertation. She says, Douglas Karen says, quote, hubris is doing and saying things at which the victim incurs shame, not in order that the agent of the hubris should obtain anything other than the performance of the act, but in order to please himself. So Dr. Cairns is saying hubris is when someone acts to shame another, and the reason they do this is because of the pleasure it brings down. They feel superior. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, and Cairns references Aristotle. Aristotle, in his work on rhetoric, states that the person who engages in hubris does so because they think they become superior to the one that they are insulting. This is why they engage in hubris. Let me read to you specifically. Now I'm going to give you some not secondary literature, but primary literature. This is Aristotle's writing on rhetoric. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher. And this is what he said about people who engage in hubris. He has a whole section here that deals with orge and anger, and he talks about, and I've read from this before, he talks about people who engage in hubris. He says, quote, the cause of pleasure to those who give insult is they think that they themselves become superior by ill-treating others. Now, notice what is being said here. They give insult themselves because they think they become more superior. They gain more honor by ill-treating others. I'm going to be coming back to this because this is going to be important to our interpretation of 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. The cause of pleasure to those who give insult is that they think they become more superior by ill-treating others. That is why the young and the rich are given to insults, for by insulting, they think they are superior. Dishonor is a feature of insult, and one who dishonors belittles. For what is worthless has no repute or no honor, or they have no reputation, neither for good nor evil. So notice what Aristotle says here. Who is it who gives insult? The young and the rich. We know that in Ephesus, there were rich, young widows. There were women who were wealthy, who were rich. There were young women who were wealthy and rich. And remember what has been my argument is that it is these it's these wealthy women, some rich, maybe some older, but it seems like the false teachers, according to 2 Timothy chapter, I think it's chapter 3 or 4, that the false teachers were targeting the young, rich widows. Aristotle says that it is the young and the rich who are given to insults. The young and the rich are the ones who are practicing hubris. They're operating in the vice of hubris. Okay? So, Karn also states that Aristotle classifies hubris as, quote, a type of attitude, albeit one which is necessary manifested in word and deed. So hubris starts off as an attitude, and it manifests itself in words and in deeds. So in other words, a person who has hubris, they think they are superior or better than another. They look down upon them, and they, in word and deed, belittle other people. It causes them to feel even more superior. They feel like they get more honor because, again, the way you get more honor from others, one of the ways you do it aggressively is that you have to dishonor the person that you're talking to, the person that you're engaged with. By dishonoring them, you gain more honor. Okay? So this is what was happening with some of the women, the rich women, I believe the rich young women who were being influenced by the false teachers. And again, Aristotle says that it's the rich and the young who are given to hubris or insult. Cairns also stated in his article that hubris is, quote, a form of pleonexia. Okay, hubris is a form of pleonexia, which is covetousness. What does pleonexia do? It causes one to seek more for oneself at the expense of others. Covetousness is self-indulgence. Remember, this is what Paul is warning them away from. Hubris is a form of pleonexia, of covetousness, which causes you to seek more for yourself at the expense of others. What are these women seeking to do? To gain more honor for themselves. The rich women in there. That's why they're wearing the expensive clothing. That's why they are engaging in this teaching. This is why they're arguing with the men. They are seeking to demean and to dishonor and shame by so gaining more honor at the expense of others. All right. So according to Kitson, one more quote. According to Kitson, Dr. Kitson, she says in her dissertation, hubris was the vice that was commonly associated with a lack of restraint. What is a lack of restraint? A lack of self-control. Now, keep in mind, so let's bring this back all together. Paul is calling these women away from vice into virtue. Hubris is a virtue that causes you to seek more. It causes you to insult others. It causes you to think you are superior to others. It causes you to insult others so that you feel superior, so that you appear superior. In other words, you gain more honor. You do it at the expense of others. It is a form of a lack of self-restraint or self-control. What does Paul, in terms of virtue, call the rich young or the rich women to? He calls them to eidos, which is what? A concern not only for your own honor, but for the honor of others. This is contrary to hubris. He calls them to modest clothing. Again, he calls them to self-control. All of these virtues that he calls them to are directly in contrast to hubris. Now, Paul doesn't use the term hubris, and somebody say, well, Mike, Paul doesn't use the term hubris. This is what Dr. Kitson says in her, and I'm making the application of what she says in her dissertation to 1 Timothy chapter 2. She applies it more so to 1 Timothy chapter 1, okay? So the use of her material is my own, but I think you can see, based upon what I'm saying, that it fits. According to Dr. Kitson, hubris was a vice, hubris could be recognized by any number of motifs and allusions without the word ever being used. This type of discourse is a form of innuendo. So she's saying hubris could be talked about without even using the term, because there were certain motifs, there were certain illusions, there were certain things that could be pointed out, certain behaviors that could be pointed to that were expressions of hubris. And this is what Paul is doing. He's using innuendo. He's using an indirect way of talking about it. I'm going to talk about later why Paul, not today, I'm going to talk about later why Paul is probably using innuendo. It's a rhetorical strategy known as, let's see if I get it right, insinuatio, innuendo. One of the things that Mike Winger, I saw him say, was that Paul would not be, these women are not engaged in false teaching because he never says that the women are engaged in false teaching. Paul is using a rhetorical device known as innuendo. We're going to talk about that and why he would use that in another session as we move through the verses in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Okay, but Dr. Kitson, going back, she said hubris could be recognized by any number of motifs and allusions without the word even being used. This is a type of discourse. This type of discourse is a form of innuendo. What are some of the motifs? What are some of the allusions of hubris? She identifies this in her book on page 234 and 235, or 231, 232, 234, and 235. She identifies some of the motifs, some of the allusions. She says, quote, she identifies as hubris. She says that the false teachers who possess hubris, they did certain things. They struck out on their own. They went out on their own. They think they know everything. These are all signs of hubris. They are excessive in what they do. They seek to usurp the place of Paul. I would add to that, and also the teachers at Ephesus. They act as if their instructions and teachings are superior to Paul's, yet they are ignorant of the matters that they claim to know about. These are all signs of hubris. These are things also that Aristotle and other teachers that said these are signs of hubris. What else? They engaged in the ill treatment of others. They were disobedient. They had a shameful disregard for the norms of propriety, meaning that they disregarded the behaviors and the conduct that were deemed acceptable by society, and they lacked self-restraint or self-control. Okay, these are all signs of hubris. We see these same motifs, these same qualities laid out by Paul in regards to the rich women in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and in other chapters. First of all, the rich women are given to excess. Remember, that's one of the signs of hubris, excess. They are given to excess in dress and adornment, luxuria. This is why Paul tells them to not do this. And as we have studied, they are belittling and shaming others by this behavior. They are embracing the false teachings of the teachers, and they are spreading this false teaching. So therefore, they think that their teaching is superior. This is another sign of hubris, because they are contradicting the sound teaching that's going on, and they're promoting this false teaching. They think their teaching is superior. They are also among those that Paul speaks of in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 3 and 6. We've looked at that before. Let's go to it again. 1 Timothy chapter 3. Let's look at verse 3. Is it 1 Timothy chapter 3? Oh, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 3. If anyone teach otherwise, false teaching, and does not consent to the wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which accords with godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing. Now keep in mind what we said before. What are one of the things that is a sign of hubris? You think your teaching is superior. What does Paul say here? If anyone teaches otherwise, they're teaching otherwise, and they do not consent to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which accords, or the teaching which accords with godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing. What's another sign of hubris? You don't know what you think you know. You are ignorant of the things you think you have knowledge about. He is obsessed with disputes and arguments over words, another sign of hubris, from which come envy, strife, reviling, evil suspicions, useless wranglings of men of corrupt mind, and destitute of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gains. From such withdraw yourself. The people in Ephesus, and I would say the women, the rich women among them, who were and embraced this false teaching, they all showed signs of hubris. Okay, hubris was going on in Ephesus. Okay, so these people are disobedient. One of the signs of hubris is disobedience. They are disobedience to the teachings of Paul and to the teachings of the Lord Jesus Christ. They do not consent to wholesome words. So all of the signs of hubris are there. So what does Paul do? He calls the rich women, as well as all of the believers who are engaged in this, but especially focusing on the rich women, he calls them to virtuous behavior. Again, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. I want them to dress in modest apparel. I want them to be self-control. I want them to practice propriety, or eidos, being concerned about the honor of others. So and then also, if you go back to hold your place in 1 Timothy chapter 6, go back over real quick to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 10. One of the virtues he calls them to in verse 10, because he calls them to modest apparel, propriety, moderation, and he says, and he calls them to that which is proper for women professing godliness, good works. They are to adorn themselves with the virtue of good works. What are the good works? The good works here is referring to, now go back to 1 Timothy chapter 6, it is referring to charitable works or charitable giving to those that are in need. This is in accordance with women who profess godliness. In the first century, if you were a wealthy person, it was your obligation to give to those that are in need. It was your obligation, and it was considered godly, it was considered virtuous if you fulfill this obligation to give to the city, to contribute to the needs of the city. This is what wealthy women were supposed to do, and wealthy men. This is what you were expected to do. So Paul says, for those who profess godliness, one of the aspects of godliness is that you contribute to the needs of others. Now, in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 5, this is what Paul says. He talks about those who teach otherwise, and he talks about what arises out of that is useless wranglings of men of corrupt mind, destitute of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. From such withdraw yourself. Notice here that he says that one of the things that this false teaching produces is the idea that godliness is a means to gain. In other words, this false teaching is saying that godliness is a way to enrich yourself, when Paul is saying true teachings of godliness is not about enriching yourself, it's about enriching others. It's about enriching. And this is what he calls the rich woman to in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 10. He also calls them to it in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Go to verse 17. Verse 17. Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they may be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, stirring up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold of eternal life. So Paul is calling them to the virtue of good works, because this is in alignment with what godliness looks like for both men and women. By the way, both men and women, if you are truly godly and you're wealthy, it was part of your obligation to contribute to those that are in need, to contribute to the benefit of the city. Okay? This is what Paul is doing. He's calling these women away in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 and 10, from the dishonorable, demeaning, disruptive behavior. He's calling them to honorable behavior. He's calling them to virtuous behavior. So let's look at one other virtue that Paul calls the women to. And this is where we're going to end. Go back to 1 Timothy chapter 2. I'm going to briefly touch on this, and we'll get into it more next week, Lord willing. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11. So Paul, verse 10, he said that, what is it that is proper for a woman professing godliness? They are to engage in good works. Then verse 11, let a woman learn in silence with all submission. Now, this is what sometimes causes people to go like, oh, Paul, he was against women. No. Keep in mind, what's the thread of Paul's teaching? What is his primary thought? He's calling the women who are embracing false teaching and are engaging in disruptive and dishonoring behavior away from that into virtuous and honorable behavior. So what does he call them to do? He calls them to learn in silence. Remember, we said that one of the signs of hubris is thinking that you know something that you don't know. So what does Paul call them to do? To learn. And how does he call them to learn? In silence. Silence was a virtue in the first century. Susan Highland, in her book, Women in the New Testament World, states that a woman's silence in certain contexts expressed virtue, and it conveyed self-control. And again, silence was not only for women, silence was for men too. Okay? It was a virtue for both men and women. All right? Silence was a virtue for both men and women. So Paul is calling the women to learn in silence. What is he contrasting this with? How had the women been learning before that? How had the women been relating and interacting with the men? Arguing, contesting their teaching with their false teaching, which Paul calls nonsense. And he tells them that they're ignorant, that they don't know what they think they know. So now he's saying, I want you to engage in honorable behavior, which is learning the truth in silence, which conveys self-control if you're learning in silence. And also, it acknowledges and expresses honor towards the one who is speaking and teaching. When a student would sit and listen to the teaching, they were honoring their teacher. So once again, what we see Paul doing is he's moving the rich woman. Paul is not saying women can't talk in church. That's not the context. He's telling these rich women who had embraced false teaching, and because of the false teaching, it had worked in them an attitude of hubris. And this attitude of hubris was calling them to engage in behaviors that were dishonoring, that was demeaning, and that was disruptive. They would disrupt by challenging and arguing with the teachers based upon myths and genealogies, based upon a wrong understanding that Paul talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 1, a wrong understanding of the law, a wrong understanding of Torah. Okay? In chapter 2, Paul is saying, move away from this behavior, move back into honorable behavior. I want you to move back into behavior that is virtuous. I want you to be concerned about the honor of the community. I want you to be self-control. I want you to express that self-control by being quiet and allowing yourself to learn from these people who do have the truth. He was not telling them they can't talk, as some people have interpreted this text in the assembly, that women can't speak. He was saying, no, you women, he's talking to first century rich women at Ephesus who are engaged in the vice of hubris. He says, move away from the hubris, get back to humility, learn from those who know the truth. And if you're learning in silence, you're honoring those who are teaching you, and you're displaying the virtue of self-control, because silence for both men and women was an expression of self-control. So once again, he's moving the women away from disruptive and dishonorable and demeaning behavior to honorable and virtuous behavior. And by the way, it is a behavior that honors and protects the honor of everyone. This virtuous behavior, see, this is what Paul is doing. And this, when I start to understand this, I went, oh my God, what Paul is not trying to put down women. Paul himself is seeking to protect and maintain the honor of the rich women and of the entire community. He's calling them to virtues that will bring them honor. The very thing that they want, Paul is saying, you can have it, honor, just don't try to get it in the way that you're trying to get it, by demeaning, by dishonoring, by disrupting others. No, engage in honorable behavior, engage, or we put it like this, engage in virtuous behavior that will bring you honor, and it will bring honor to the entire community. They will be practicing ADES. They will be concerned not only with their own honor, but they will be upholding, protecting, and preserving the honor of the community. So Paul is not seeking to restrict women from serving in pastoral leadership alongside men or in relation to men. In these passages that we see, and we haven't even got to chapter 2, verse 12 yet, but now we're at verse 11 now. Paul is calling them from verse 9 all the way down to verse 11 to virtuous behavior, to protect their honor and the honor of the community. And I'll say this in closing. And I thought about this when Aaron was teaching, and I was looking over my notes just before he stopped. It hit me that what Paul demonstrates in 1 Timothy chapter 2, especially verses 9 through 11, and I'll say verse 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, he is demonstrating how important the women were to the honor of the community in the eyes of the outside world. The women were important in protecting and preserving the honor of the community. What these rich women were doing and what they did, what these women and what they did was important for the preservation of honor in the home and in the church. I think we've missed that. They were important for the honor of the community. So Paul was calling them back to honor, to virtuous behavior, because virtuous behavior will lead to honor, and the virtuous behavior and honor of the women would cause the community, would cause their husbands, would cause the men, the teachers, it would cause the entire community to be seen as honorable. Paul was trying to protect the honor of the women, not restrict them from pastoral authority. All right, I'm going to stop right there. We will cover more of this next week. I think I'm going to go back and talk a little bit more about 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11. I got a little bit more to add to that I think you'll find interesting. And I believe, Lord willing, we will go into verse 12 and talk about what is being said based off of everything we've talked about thus far. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you learned a lot. If you have, please leave me a comment in the comment section below. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel, KIC TV, leave a comment. Let me know how this blessed you and helped you. And also hit the subscribe button, share this video with others. It helps the algorithm go out. We want to get this teaching out to other people because there is a move to try to continue to grow again this idea that women cannot serve alongside men equally in pastoral leadership. That is contrary to the will of God. I think when we interpret these passages in their proper context, we begin to see that that is not the case. So help us get the message out by sharing this video and clicking on the subscribe button. So for those of you watching on Facebook, I will be uploading this to our YouTube channel, KIC TV, keeping it in context within the next 24 hours. Lord willing, we will be back here next week. And since this is Father Day, happy Father Day to all of the fathers out there. And God bless. And Lord willing, again, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.